Everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Welcome to our webinar on integrating open source software into your business. I'm Andrew Joint. I'm a commercial technology partner here at Kemp, and I'm delighted to be joined today by one of my colleagues, Edwin Baker, a commercial technology managing associate, and we're also joined by Dr. Andreas Kotulla, founder and CEO of Bitsea. Dr. Andreas Kotulla is a founder and managing director of Bitsea and has been working in the IT area for more than 25 years. Now, Bitsea analyzes, assesses, and optimizes software development processes, architecture, and design to ensure future-proofness for their software products. Andreas himself studied computer science in Germany and in the USA and did his doctor's degree in the University of Hohenheim before starting Bitsea 10 years ago. And he's worked in leading positions with global telecommunications operators as well, including holding several patents and developing key technologies for the mobile internet. He's also published books about software management and outsourcing. So we're delighted to have him with us here today. Ed specializes in negotiating and drafting commercial technology contracts with an IT focus and helps lead our open source focus here at Kemp Little. He's recognized in Chambers and Partners as a legal profession as an associate to watch. So delighted to have a couple of great speakers for us today. If I look a little bit at our agenda today, what you'll see on screen is that we'll have a bit of a run through about some case studies in relating to open source security and ensuring compliance with the organization before we start looking at tricks and techniques to integrate open source helpfully into your business. Open source adoption is expanding rapidly and it's bringing improved productivity and reducing development costs. But with that expansion, there's come a number of high-profile incidents involving open source software, and that's helped highlight some of the accompanying security and compliance risks which come along with OSS. Managed effectively, open source, I think, is a valuable addition, but when you're not on top of your open source usage and your legal obligations, it can leave you vulnerable and unable to upgrade or patch for known bugs. So before we leap into that, a little bit of housekeeping and a little bit of admin. During the next 45 minutes, we'll offer you a chance to submit some questions. I know some people have already, and thanks for that. I'll be reviewing and submitting these questions to our speakers later on. The instructions on how to listen, and I'm guessing you're pretty good at that already as you're listening now, are up on the screen now. By default, you're listening in using your computer speaker system. If you'd prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone and the dial information will be displayed. But as I say, please submit your questions. We'll try and get through as many of those as possible towards the end of the session. In addition to that, I'm really pleased that we're also running some poll questions for you, which will help us get a feeling for issues and concerns that you all have out there regarding to open source. The first of those is on screen now and will be open to vote for a few minutes. So please do take some time to answer the poll questions. It helps, and we'll be able to respond to the responses to the poll questions a bit later on. So, as a young tech lawyer, I was passed a copy of Eric Raymond's excellent and very readable The Cathedral and the Bazaar, and I was fascinated by the philosophical background to the open source software debate and how what's become the established proprietary software model, the Cathedral, could be challenged by the belief that open source code helped development and problem fixing using the Bazaar. A key thesis from that book, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, shaped my approach to problem solving and can be seen in other really salient books and texts such as The Wisdom of Crowds, a book we give all new joiners here at Kemp Little. So there are often discussed benefits to open source use, but if you're listening today, you're probably aware of all of those benefits and you're listening because you want to know how to get the integration of those right. So I'm going to stop. And Andreas, over to you. Why don't you start by giving us some real world viewpoints around software integration issues?
Yeah, thank you, Ed. You may have heard from the Equifax incidents last year. And if Equifax has taught us anything, it's that a third-party security and compliance risks are dangerously threatening the integrity of the software supply chain. The Equifax breach provided a unique look into how many breaches occur. In Equifax's case, hackers exploited an unpatched Apache Struts component, resulting in the exposure of over 140 million consumer records. The exploit of this vulnerability highlights the need for visibility to open source and custom applications and just how inefficient traditional security solutions are when it comes to open source vulnerabilities. Further, while class action lawsuits have already begun, Equifax faces other regulatory challenges as well. The US Federal Trade Commission started investigations into the company's security policies and controls that will likely result in financial penalties. Since the exposed data included non-US citizens, foreign data protection and data privacy regulations may also come into play. Overall, this was not a complicated attack. The vulnerability was known months before and patches were available. However, patching is pretty hard. In a complex infrastructure, there are many components, and for all of these, patches are released frequently. For each patch installation, it needs to be ensured the whole ecosystem is still operational, which involves massive retests. Operations need to quantify each patch, whether it needs to be urgently installed or is nice to have. The conclusion is that it is very important to exactly know which open source packages are installed and where they are used in your organization.
So I think despite OSS being cited as a problem in examples such as with Equifax, there can be often a bit of confusion about what exactly OSS is. And the reason for this is that OSS is not a very precise label, and it's really evolved as an umbrella term that refers to a variety type of software licenses that share certain features. There's a number of competing definitions, but the OSI definition, which you see a link to on your screen, is the one that's more commonly used. And important thing to note about this is the OSI makes clear that open source software is more than just about source code access. The OSI definition sets out 10 attributes a license needs to meet to be regarded as OSS, and the summary is on your slide in front of you. But essentially, a software license which is free in the sense of no license fees, but not free of restriction. The software can be redistributed, allows use for any purpose, allows access to the source code, and also allows modification and derivative works of the original software. There are many different types of OSS licenses that are available and can be used for open source projects. And each of these licenses have a varying degree of different features and requirements. And I'll come on to these a little later. While that answers what OSS is, it doesn't explain why OSS usage is so prolific. And Andreas, I think you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have a short introduction from a development point of view. Good developers do not write code from scratch. They know where to get code. Leveraging the benefits of open source and managing the risks, code reuse is encouraged. However, open source has the risks of license restrictions and security vulnerabilities. Open source is not in the public domain, but instead is available for use only under one of a variety of licenses that impose restrictions on users. These licenses differ, and it is important to know and observe their terms. Some of these, for example, require the code is published after modifications have been implemented. This leads to the risk of high cost, or it may even be that code cannot be used in a commercial scenario. Also, the open source code can contain known security vulnerabilities. That said, there's amazing value in open source. You just need to know how to comply. And for this, we are talking about 5 actions today. So discovering, managing, and complying in 5 actions. Once you know the risks associated, you need to figure out how to get a handle on the open source components your company is using. There are 5 key actions that you can use to understand what your company is doing and set up a process for discovering, managing, and complying with the OSS issues. Next slide, please. As you may know, the majority of organizations use more open source code in their products than code they've written themselves, which expedites the product's creation process. The problem with this is that many organizations, when using open source, do so with no regard for the licenses associated with the code they use. Because open source is free to use, many companies misunderstand that they still need to respect the legalities associated with its licensing, such as passing along a copyright statement or a copy of the license text, or providing the entire source code for the company's product. Often, enterprises are largely unaware of the percentage of open source their products depends on, and it's impossible for them to be aware of the legal responsibilities associated with the code they don't know they are using. Software vulnerabilities could also negatively affect your product, and lacking awareness about what open source code you are using will put you behind the curve on upgrades or patches for known software bugs, as we have just heard.
So, as I mentioned earlier, OSS is a generic term that's used to describe types of software license that mandate certain freedoms. It's important to be aware, though, that the terms of OSS licenses are not the same. They do vary between the different licenses. And on the slide there, you'll see I've set out a small number of some of the most popular licenses. And one key way in which these OSS licenses vary is how code modifications are treated under the license terms. There are broadly two ways in which modifications are treated: the approach under the permissive licenses, and those are towards the right-hand side of the diagram, and the approach on the restricted licenses, those towards the left. Now, dealing with these in turn, firstly, on permissive licenses, these only require that the distribution of the original software be on the same OSS license terms. Importantly, permissive licenses permit a licensee to freely amend code and relicense it. This amendment is often called a derivative work, however the licensee wants. In other words, you can modify permitted OSS and license it however you want. Restrictive OSS licenses, on the other hand, go one step further, and these impose licensing restrictions on any derivative works that are based on the OSS. While the provisions vary, restrictive OSS licenses will apply to both the original OSS and also any derivative works based upon it. Now, this is known as the copyleft principle, and you might often see the logo of it, kind of the typical copyright symbol backwards. When you see that, that's referring to the copyleft principle. And as you see on the diagram, the more copyleft licenses are towards the left and the more permissive are on the right. And there are some kind of in-between licenses that contain some copyleft type mechanisms in the middle. The GPL, or the General Public License, is the most notorious strong copyleft license. The GPL copyleft mechanism has a very expansive view of what it regards as a derivative work. For example, when GPL code from one program is statically or dynamically linked to code from another, the GPL license regards the linked code as a derivative work and subject to the GPL license. So why do organizations care if GPL licensing is spreading throughout its code? Well, in short, on distribution, the GPL requires that distributed copies must be distributed under the same terms of the GPL license and include source code or an offer to provide it upon request. And failure to comply with these results in automatic termination of the original source code license. The licenses in the middle of the diagram allow you to avoid this copyleft mechanism in certain very technically specific ways. For example, LGPL allows dynamic linking in certain scenarios that doesn't trigger this mechanism. The two key points I want to make on all of this is, well, firstly, the OSS obligations differ significantly under the different OSS licenses. And for the restrictive licenses, the point at which this copyleft mechanism happens is not uniform between the different licenses. For this reason, it's really important to be on top of and managing your OSS licenses in your organization, as what works for one type of license won't necessarily work for another type of OSS license. While copyleft and managing the risk of restrictive OSS licenses is a major part of the legal issues that arise with OSS, it's not the only one. I've set out a number of these that lawyers dealing with OSS typically have to deal with when dealing with OSS, but this gives a flavor of the kind of things that organizations should be aware of. Just to take a few of these in turn. Firstly, on distribution and what this actually means. The obligations in almost all OSS licenses are only triggered upon distribution of the OSS. Now, unhelpfully, distribution is mainly not defined within the licenses, but it's generally taken to mean the point at which software is provided from one party to another party. Any organization using OSS needs to look how and when it's using OSS and when it's being distributed. Now, this can be quite a simple question, particularly in the case of a supplier providing code to its customers, but it can become a more complex question when looking at less clear examples. For example, provision throughout a group of companies, provision of software to outsourcing partners, hosting partners, those kind of scenarios. Is distribution happening in those scenarios? Has that been thought through? Unhelpfully, distribution is defined in some OSS licenses, meaning the approach isn't uniform. For example, the Affero GPL regards the provision of services over the internet using software as a form of distribution. And in that scenario, the copyleft mechanism in that license may apply. Most other OSS licenses wouldn't include that kind of software as a service type usage as distribution. So it's a prime example of how you really need to be aware of what OSS licenses you're using and how you're using them. Turning to governing law and jurisdiction, part of the problem with OSS licenses is that most don't include governing law and jurisdiction clauses. Despite this, the majority of licenses are drafted using US copyright law terminology and concepts, and this really causes you two issues. Firstly, it's a question of international rules to determine which law and jurisdiction are going to be governing your OSS licenses. And these are not uniform, and they're derived from a number of sources. For example, the Brussels and Rome regulations cover these kind of issues in the EU. Outside of that, there are other conventions, for example, the Hague Convention. How and where OSS is being used will impact on which legal system and jurisdiction will apply to your OSS licenses. Assuming an OSS license is not being governed by a law of a US state, this means you have the situation where local copyright law terminology and concepts are not the same as those which are being used in the OSS license. This hasn't deterred courts, however, from having a go. Germany in particular has looked at the GPL a number of times, and the copyright law rules in Germany are not the same as in the US and how the GPL is drafted. But it does add to the complexity of understanding how these OSS licenses will be interpreted and applied in practice, and particularly in dispute type context. For organizations using OSS in different jurisdictions or distributing to customers in different countries, it's important to understand what jurisdictions and laws are applying to your OSS usage. Another issue that can cause concern on the legal side is whether an OSS license is a copyright license or whether it's in fact just a contract between two parties. Now, the distinction is significant as it can have a major impact on the remedies available in a non-compliance scenario. In copyright, for example, if a breach of a copyright license may result in remedies such as an injunction against infringement, whereas with breach of contract, the usual remedy is damages. The views expressed by the Free Software Foundation, who are the authors of the GPL, and this has been supported by the US Court of Appeals in the Jacobson case, is that restrictive licenses such as the GPL are actually copyright licenses. A number of OSS commentators, though, don't agree with this analysis, and it's not clear whether in other courts, either within or outside the USS, would reach the same conclusion. The German courts have supported this copyright license analysis, but there are many jurisdictions, the UK included, where this has not yet been tested. So it's not quite clear what remedies would be available in the event of an OSS license breach. Onward licensing and liability. This is a particular concern where an organization is taking OSS and then providing it to its customer base. Often OSS is included as part of a broader software product, which is then onward licensed under a single set of license terms. And this can create a number of issues. The first and the most obvious one is, are you actually allowed to license OSS on different terms? This is okay for some licenses, but not all. Secondly, whether in an outward licensing situation, is a supplier or an organization making a conscious decision to make legal promises about OSS? If you've ever looked at an OSS license, generally there are no promises about anything. The software is provided as is, with no warranties of any kind, no liabilities of any kind are accepted. So unless this is being specially dealt with in an organization's kind of outward bound contracts, an organization is potentially making legal promises about OSS when it's got zero recourse from where the OSS came from. There have been a number of IPR infringement claims, for example, in the US, and organizations need to decide if they're providing IPR indemnities to their customers, are they fine with indemnifying their customers against those kind of claims where they've had no involvement in the infringement in the first place, but they're kind of recompensing their customers because of it. Linked to this point, in some contexts, suppliers often make warranties and commitments about security of solutions that are being provided and steps that are being taken around security. As mentioned, licenses will provide zero commitment on this front. So it's a key question to determine what security steps are being taken in relation to OSS. And are you happy making contractual promises about security when you're not sure, how you're actually using this? The new requirements under the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, have resulted in much higher security commitments being added into contracts of all types and sizes. and often without considering the OSS dimension to those new commitments. Finally, just a quick note on reputation. Failing to control OSS can have reputational consequences. Andreas has already highlighted the Equifax case, which is a huge example on the security side of how reputation of an organization can be affected. But on the licensing side as well, failure to comply with OSS can also result in, well, it's technically copyright infringement or potentially a license breach. So there can be litigation brought against you by the copyright holder of the original OSS. So there could be litigation brought against your organization. Outside of litigation, there are open source pressure groups that seek to compel organizations to comply with license terms. This is particularly common in the consumer device space. But if you do a quick Google of the phrase Hall of Shame and then put an OSS license after it, you'll quickly throw out this kind of naming and shaming culture that exists in the OSS community. So that's a bit of a canter through some of the main legal issues with OSS and kind of taking these all together, why it shows it's important for an organization to control, manage and comply with OSS licenses. So I think on that note, that takes us to the next poll, Andrew.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Ed. So thanks both. So I think we've established there that there are some proper case studies and legal issues and operational issues in relation to the implementation of OSS. Before we start looking at some of the solutions about how to do that properly, let's go and revisit that first poll. So I think just coming up onto your screen now is the shared poll results. We asked in relation to how ready are your organizations in relation to or how prepared are you for open source software. 79% of you saying OSS is already incorporated into our business, with only 5% saying it's an entirely new conversation to us, which is great, because I think actually those 5%, I'm sure you will probably find OSS is in your organization already, you're just perhaps not aware. But in relation to that 79% OSS, who are aware and already incorporated into your business. It's interesting to think, I think with Ed's slides and conversations around the type of open source and the variations on the different types of open source licenses involved, I wonder how much, Ed, do you think that there might be a difference in relation to the types of licenses used?
Yeah, I think quite often, Andrew, organizations are aware they're using OSS, but not quite down to the component level or the actual license type. I think Andreas mentioned in his example there, that quite often there are patches for problems that come up, but often organizations are kind of suffering a vulnerability about actually knowing that they're using this particular component in place. I think Equifax is a prime example of that. Heartbleed was another example of that a few years ago. So I think simply knowing the OSS is being used is not quite, it's a helpful start, but doesn't necessarily address all the problems.
And what about you, Andreas? Is that sort of backed up by you sort of in terms of the number of organizations who are actively using OSS now?
Yeah, so I'm happy to see that more and more organizations are getting into managing their open source and that they are more and more aware that it is an important item in their business. If we would have asked the same poll a couple of years ago, I think the numbers would just have been quite reverse. So there are very many, most of the organizations were totally unaware of OSS. So this growing awareness is a good sign. But still, as Ed said, it's important to understand it down to the last level.
Okay, so that's great. So we're going to publish the next poll, our second poll, actually. So this time, typical lawyers focusing on risk and problem. But we're asking the question, do you see OSS as a security issue, an IP issue, a business risk, or none of the above? And obviously, we see OSS as a huge opportunity as well. But let us know about if it's a security issue, IP issue, business risk, or none of the above. In addition, thank you for those who are sending through some questions. Really helpful, very interesting questions. Any more, please do send them on. But we've talked about problems, we've talked about challenges. Now let's move on to actually how we go about the integration into our business. And Andreas, back over to you.
Thank you. So I'll now talk about best practices that we have seen in the last years on how to discover, manage, and comply to open source components. There are many ways that open source can enter your company. The classic case is that a developer decides to use an open source component, downloads the source code, and incorporates that source code into their product. This is still a very common case, but there are many other ways that open source ends up being used in an organization. Often, developers will use what is known as a repository manager. This allows developers to specify the components that they want to use and download the source code or a compiled binary file, as well as any dependencies that this component may have. Repository managers typically store the open source components in a separate repository outside of your classic source code management system. Some common repository managers are Maven, Nugget, or NPM. Another way that open source comes into an organization is as a subcomponent of a commercial or a larger open source component. It is very common to have multiple open source subcomponents or dependencies for a single top-level component. These subcomponents are often not disclosed or managed. Additionally, open source will be used as a runtime infrastructure, pieces such as web servers, operating systems, or databases. All of these components may be pulled in by developers, graphic designers, procurement, professional services, IT administrators, and many others. This is no longer only a developer-based process. Once you know the ways that open source is selected and used, you can start performing an assessment of what components you depend on and how they are being utilized or distributed. This is typically known as building your bill of material, essentially your open source disclosure list. This list is used to follow the obligations, modify open source your policy, and react to published vulnerabilities. It is common to find open source packages that have licensing obligations that your organization isn't able to follow. This puts you out of compliance with the license. In these cases, the open source component needs to be removed and the functionality replaced either through the use of another open source component or by writing equivalent functionality. Code-based reviews, interviews, and scanning tools can be helpful during this process. As projects get larger, more complex, and more distributed, it has become harder to discover all of the pieces that are in use. This makes it important to have periodic conversations with the developers, DevOps, and IT personnel involved with the creation, deployment, and running of the project in question. Asking targeted questions such as, what database do we use? Or what encryption libraries do we use? Can be helpful in discovering other modules that may have been missed in the first time. Simply asking, what open source are we using, rarely creates a complete list for a few reasons, including that the knowledge of what open source components were selected often has disappeared from memory or the company. There's also a misunderstanding or lack of knowledge among many developers about what is considered open source. There should be a consistent and enforced process for managing your third-party usage. This allows your organization to properly comply with open source license obligations, as well as be able to react to new vulnerabilities. It is common to have teams with varying level of completeness and compliance. Some organizations are currently only tracking components that have been requested by developers. These type of companies find that they are often only tracking the larger pieces of open source, or have some developers who are better than others in following the process. Other companies use scanning technology to help discover and track open source. Depending on the scanner used or the level of analysis performed, varying degrees of discovery will be found. Some tools only discover license text, not actual open source components. Others can find components managed by packet managers, but can't find anything else. It's important to understand the level of analysis performed and what should be expected to be found. It's common to come into compliance in phases as more components are discovered and managed. Once you create policies, start looking and managing open source and requiring compliance with the open source obligations, it is important to confirm that this compliance is visible. Do you see the required attributions or copyright notices in the product or documentation? Do you see the license text as required? Is there a written offer for source code or the actual source code distributions for any copyleft style license content you may be using? These are all visible indicators of an effective open source management process. By going through these 5 actions, in addition to educating your company on how to use open source correctly and encouraging other enterprises to do the same, you'll be able to integrate open source into your applications while respecting licensing agreements. Not only will this keep you more informed and aware of the code in your products, it also creates a more secure product for your customers. The conclusion is, following these actions educates your company on how to use open source correctly, encourages other enterprises to do the same, allows you to integrate open source into your applications while respecting license agreements, will keep you more informed and aware of the code in your products, and creates a more secure product for your customers. Okay, thank you. Back to Ed.
Thanks, Andreas. So what I wanted to finish on was just kind of what key principles and objectives can you kind of take away from what we've heard today. And I think the key objectives when dealing with OSS, it's really similar to any other IP-based policies and governance. It's all about reducing and managing the risk that arises with OSS through governance. And almost all OSS problems are caused by ignoring and not managing OSS. So it's kind of the solution kind of follows that if you kind of actively address it and try and manage it, that really does address kind of a big number of the issues we talked about today. So what are the key principles of OSS governance? Well, I've kind of tried to distill them down to 6 kind of principles which are key for any OSS approach by an organization. I think a number of these were touched on already by Andreas, but I think firstly on acquisition, you need to know what OSS your organization is using, and that comes from a few veins. There need to be guidelines to employees about when it can be used, and when it is, what process needs to follow. And as was touched on, a high-level macro view is rarely very helpful. You need to know what code's being used, what license, and right down to the component level, what version. You know, if there's a security problem in relation to a very specific version of a component, you're not going to know about it unless you have this in place around acquisition. The second point is around source reliability. You need to know where the open source is coming from. You get some open source packages that are from a very reputable source that is very well used by thousands of developers, but you also get open source locations where it's used by very few developers, not updated very often, and you have to make a judgment whether you're happy using certain sources for open source or not. Tracking. You need to know what OSS does and where it's being used and reused. And as I touched on before, distribution is a key point of OSS. Are you distributing OSS? And if so, are you mapping those obligations around that? As with any governance, roles and responsibilities are important. You need to know who is responsible for what in relation to the OSS. And this can quite often follow areas such as escalation and pathways. Who needs to be made aware of certain things are being used? You know, people need to know who's responsible for open source. It's not a case of one compliance manager. It's very much across an organization. People need to know what their responsibilities are around it. License selection. You know, I touched on before the different types of OSS, particularly the restrictive permissive distinction. You need to know what licenses you are or aren't happy to deal with in your organization. And it may be the case that it's only certain contexts that you're not happy using certain OSS licenses. And particularly on the distribution point, again, you may want to be more careful on your distribution usage around restricted OSS licenses than perhaps just internal use type cases. And setting up and managing what you're happy with from an acceptable risk profile goes to the heart of this. And finally, license compliance. Know what your organization is complying with its OSS obligations. This is essentially mapping your usage against the license requirements. And again, doing periodic verification to check in those use cases, you know, are you complying with the licenses? So that's a bit of a run through on kind of the key objectives and principles for managing OSS.
Great. So thanks both. So some really handy implementation tricks from people who have actually been through this, both on the legal and on the operational side there. So what about our poll? Let's go back to our second poll. Do you see OSS as, we asked, do you see it as a security issue, an IP issue, a business risk, or none of the above? I'm pleased that nobody ticked none of the above. 0% voting for that. It seems like it's a good raw mix of people and their perception of this as an issue in different bits and pieces. But it's clear that IP risk and IP issue is one of the key challenges that people are perceiving the use of open source as. Ed, is that borne out by practice and the complexity in OSS licenses out there?
Yeah, I think the IP concern that you potentially have to give the source code of your potentially proprietary solutions out to the wider world, or whoever's receiving it, is a big concern, and it often crops up not only on the operational side, but particularly around M&A type activity. You can suddenly find that what you thought were the crown jewels of an organization, you potentially have to give away. So IP concern is absolutely a key concern around this.
And Andreas, does that bear out in relation to security issues, security risk and business risk in terms of that percentage of concern?
So what we see very often with our customers when we start with an audit, the IP issue is the key why they start with an audit. But once they see the result and they see that in the open source there are many security issues, then the security issues are the first ones that the customers jump on and try to fix those.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting anecdotally from this end, the amount of due diligence activity around open source we now see in merger and acquisition has exponentially increased in the last 5 years and has material impact, I think, on transactions we've seen here. So now, having had those great run-throughs, I'm going to turn to a few different questions, and thanks again for everyone who's been involved in submitting those. Andreas, I'm going to come to you first, actually. So we've heard about open source and its usage, but how many different types of open source packages would we typically find in an average project? Like, what's the sort of size of this concern, issue, problem, challenge?
So this very much depends on the size of the project or system that we're looking at. If you take an average size system, some years ago, we would have talked about 30 to 50 open source packages. Nowadays, we can find 300 to 500 different open source packages used in a standard size systems. And we've even seen systems that have more than 1,000 different open source components.
Wow. Okay. And then obviously the logic from that, meaning that obligation and commitment that we've been talking about in terms of getting your implementation right is sort of 6-7 times greater than it perhaps was a few years ago, because you've got 300 rather than 40 or 50 packages.
Yes, and not even that. Some years ago, you would have some very big packages with lots of functionality, but all had the same license. Now with the repository managers, you will have 300 packages with 300 different licenses, which makes it a nightmare from a legal perspective.
Yeah, it sounds great for the lawyers, huh? Ed, how about you? Well, I mean, so tell me this, with the increasing importance of cloud computing and locally run software on-premise being less used, is OSS still relevant? Isn't it becoming a bit irrelevant, something organizations can ignore?
I think the short answer to that is no, but it really is still relevant, even in the cloud context. And I think there's a few main reasons for that. I think firstly, I've already mentioned the Affera GPL. That regards distribution over a kind of a cloud deployment scenario as triggering the OSS license. So it can still come up. But often if you look at who is hosting in a cloud context, you're often providing software to third parties. You may be transferring it around. So distribution is still happening. So I think just because it's cloud doesn't mean it's irrelevant. I think, we touched on Equifax earlier. The security of OSS is still a key problem regardless of the deployment model, whether it's cloud or not. So it kind of OSS is still important in kind of managing that regardless of the deployment type. And finally, I think that the last thing to add is while cloud has become, certainly big in the industry, there's been the emergence of certain complementary technologies that have gone alongside that. Take mobile apps, for example, Internet of Things, IoT. All of these things involve locally run software. So, and OSS is very much involved there. So it's a bit of a shifting picture, but it's still as relevant as always.
But if I can sort of keep up on the thread of the legal, that's still relevant, still interesting. But come on, let's be realistic. Have you seen GPL terms enforced in practice?
Yeah, I think the answer to that again is yes. I think Andreas mentioned scanners. It's very easy now to look at find a package and see what code's kind of included in it. And I mentioned the name and shame pressure groups. People do look for this. And if they do find GPL license code that's been modified or linked, and that there's value to getting the source of that, people do come after that. I think that there's, on the litigation context, there's examples of cases in the US and also Germany of GPL being enforced. It's not actually something that's happened in the UK. It's generally something that's resolved pre-action.
And Andreas, one for you, which has come in. How are companies managing open source today? You've told us about how they should be doing it, but what are you seeing out in the real world just in a moment, how people are doing it?
So in Germany, we're seeing that many companies are just starting with managing their open source assets. So they have realized it's an important item. And typically they start with a manual review of their source code and their components and an Excel list, and then are overwhelmed by the results. We see a rising demand in open source audits, and companies who have adapted to an open source process, they typically use some off-the-shelf scanning tools to keep track of their inventory and also to keep it up to date. And they scan everything regularly. So every new release of a system will be scanned.
Yeah, excellent. And Ed, I think I'll have this probably as the last question, to always finish early, as they say. Ed, you can't have a talk on IT or technology law without talking about GDPR. I'm pleased you've mentioned it already, but so questions come in. What are the privacy-related risks for using open source software, and how is it best to manage them?
I think data protection and open source, they are two relevant points. I think the thing to remember with all data protection legislation, not just the GDPR, even the current requirements in the UK that based on the EU Privacy Directive, is the legislation talks about appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect personal data. And to the extent you're using open source alongside personal data, that technical and organizational requirement will apply. And we've talked about today, the things you can do from both an organizational perspective, the policy side of things, and the technical perspective, things you can be doing to secure your OSS. So I think the two things do go hand in hand, and I think the legislation obviously doesn't talk about OSS explicitly, but I think it's as with any other IT system, if you're failing in your controls and essentially your care around that, it's going to place you in breach of the data protection legislation in any way, as with any other IT system, if you're kind of not being careful around it. So I think it's just as relevant to OSS as it is with any other area.
But it's not a prohibitor. GDPR is not a prohibitor for using OSS.
No, not at all. Again, it's agnostic. All data protection legislation doesn't say don't use technology. It's just use it in a way that's thought through, that protects personal data, and kind of governance and management. So kind of a big part of that.
Excellent. Well, listen, thanks both, and thanks to all of you who are listening and attending on today's webinar about integrating open source software into your business, a practical guide to getting it right. We've tried to answer everyone's questions, but we're just about run out of time. We'll follow up individually on the questions we didn't get to address today, and you will also receive a follow-up email within the next 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. But it just leaves it for me to say, on behalf of Kemp and Bitsea, on behalf of Ed, Andreas and myself, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.